Hello and welcome to a new series of PolitiBabble. And on today's episode, I will be joined by...
Mika Chan.
And as well as a special guest...
Richard Karen.
Well, thank you very much for coming along today. Mika is in a new temporary position as co-host, as Archibald is off on his study leave. So I'm sure Archie's actually listening. So hello, Archie. And as well, we have a very special guest, Mr. Karen, who is going to be giving us interesting thoughts, as well as Mika as well. We'll have the usual current affairs as well, but first of all, Mika, we have a question to ask, don't we?
So our first feature, which is always asked when we have a guest on, if you were a cake, what cake would you be?
Yeah, so I used to live in the southwest of France, and there's a cake down in the southwest of France called Dacquoise. It says what it is on the tin. It comes from the little town of Dax. And it's this sort of multi-layered cake. It's a chocolate multi-layered cake, but the first layer is kind of a nutty, nuggety, meringue thing. So I think kind of I am a bit nutty. I'm a bit out there sometimes, especially with some of my opinions. But I'm also meringue. I'm sweet. I'm kind. I'm sensitive. So I think that sums me up well. The second layer is usually a buttercream layer, which kind of says a lot about my love of sugar. So I would think that describes me quite well.
Sounds lovely. Sounds lovely indeed. I always loved the cake question at the first, because it just gives a bit of an insight into the personality, and the cake question is so lovely because it just gives everyone their individuality, which is lovely. So welcome along, and it's a new season here on PolitiBabble. So we're changing things up as we always do to keep it engaging as well. So first of all, on this week's episode, we're going to be talking about sort of politics in education, essentially. I know Mika's been doing some interesting research into that specifically. So if you want to give a little bit of background, and then we'll go over to you about coming into teaching and your role currently. So if you want to go first, Mika.
So we kind of had thought up this topic and thought to invite Sarah along to get a bit more of an insight into how politics is handled within schools, within the school environment, by teachers, not only how it's taught but how it's addressed and how potentially it's implicated deeper than we think within the school system. And I know that there's been in recent years some kind of reform of syllabuses under Michael Gove, obviously, and curriculums have been altered and changed, and political expression in the past few years has become more and more of kind of a prominent subject within the school environment. So we thought it would be a good idea to who better to invite along than Mr. Karen.
Definitely, as the director of sixth form at Ballacameen, I suppose politics is one of the only schools on the island out of how many? 5. There's only, I think, 3 that maybe offer politics, and it's definitely one of the reasons why I moved, because of my interest. And it's a shame that not all of the schools offer it. And I think that at Ballacameen, the students have always got great opinions, and I think that's a really nice thing about the Ballacameen sixth form, is that politics is offered. So firstly, what sort of got you into teaching, and as terms of the curriculum at Ballacameen for sixth form, do you get a choice on what can be offered or not?
Okay, multi-layered question. What got me into teaching? It's kind of a little bit soppy, I suppose. I had an amazing teacher, inspiration, role model figure who significantly changed and shifted how I thought about life and how I wanted to work, and how hard I would have to work. Tough love, all that kind of stuff that makes you more round as a person. That guy was called Jeff Hawkins, actually, and he was my head of sixth form. And that when I saw him in action, and I saw him developing people in the way that he did, and mentoring people in the way that he did, I thought, this is very much something I want to do. And I was only 17, 18 years old at that point, so I would like to point out and preface that previously I wanted to be a pilot, but at those days you couldn't be a pilot when you had glasses. So second choice was to go into teaching, and yeah, it very much was that. I also had something that would make that advantageous for me was my love of France. And I think if you have a subject that you're very passionate about and that you absolutely love, then the idea of spending the rest of your life with that subject is an incredibly appealing concept. And teaching facilitates that. It gives you that idea that you can forever live with the subject. And I wanted to do that, and I still want to do that. So I've kind of married my love of my subject with this desire to help as many students as I can.
Excellent. So in terms of politics at Balcomine, has that always been offered?
Yeah, so I did it. I did it back in 1998. So I it's been definitely going since then. I did it. And in fact, my teacher is retiring this year. My fellow colleague, Mr. Watson, who taught me back in 1998, is retiring.
So cute.
It is quite cute, isn't
he
it?
taught
Yeah,
you.
he taught me. I'm not sure if I was his best ever student, but he definitely taught me. So it was around then. And you asked me before what control I have over curriculum. And I have a fair amount of control over the development of curriculum. And one thing I would say about politics is that it certainly won't be making a disappearance in my time. And all of my predecessors, because I'm the 5th head of sixth form in Ballycamine's history, and we've all been big fans of politics. It's been there. I would make the assumption, because when I did politics, it was only 1 year into the reign of Mrs. Bamford as head of sixth form, so she was the 2nd head of sixth form. Therefore, I would make the assumption it's been around since the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Well, as both me and Mika being politics students, I suppose it'd be interesting to see why you opted for politics. Is there any reasoning? Because I mean, looking at lower down the school, politics, apart from sort of maybe current affairs, are discussed in perhaps tutorial times or assembly and stuff like that. And especially Manx politics, which I've been very vocal about recently, about how I think it should be definitely offered a lot more across the whole time that young people are in education. But what really made you want to opt for politics?
So this is quite a funny story actually, because I didn't originally want to opt for politics. I had chosen another subject instead and got politics because of the blocks clashing. But I think that's another big reason for why, actually a big factor in this conversation right now is, look at me now, look how much I'm enjoying politics now. And had I not had that coincidence of events not occurred, I wouldn't be sat here right now, and I wouldn't have this political knowledge that I do, that I think is so integral to somebody of our age, to have that understanding of how things operate. And I think that really shows us that politics really isn't offered on that broad of a scale in terms of being appealing to young people, because it's offered on the curriculum for the sixth form, and people like you who have a real interest in it may opt for it, but ultimately people who have never experienced it before and who don't know what it's about will then never get that kind of exposure to it, which I think is a shame, because look how much I'm enjoying my politics now. I'm sat here speaking to you, so
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, in terms of looking at politics on the Isle of Man, obviously the curriculum that we study is actually the UK and the US, but obviously for sixth form, Manx politics doesn't really, apart from we can relate to it at points, you're only really I think the most important time to actually to educate young people about Manx politics is lower down the school, because then you need to prepare them for when they turn 16, and they can go out and vote. So in terms of politics at Ballycamine, students across the range are obviously going to have different views, and I think that's another great aspect about politics that we can enjoy in the classroom. And we've got the Voltaire Society at Balcomine, which I think's another really special thing, which other schools, they want to set up debating clubs, but there's no real drive behind that. How long has the Voltaire Society been going for?
Yeah, Voltaire started in 2017. It was my first year in the sixth form. as head of sixth form, and it began as a guy called Steve Pagan, who's the deputy head, who'd come from a school called Cheadle in Manchester, private school, and he was very keen on debating and wanted to bring the voice of the youth out, and try and make sure that it was communicated, and therefore the sort of series of guest visitors came into being, and actually, do you know, there was such a lot of people who would come in and talk to Voltaire in those first couple of years that it worked very efficiently. Obviously, over the past 2 years, I would suggest that because of COVID and how difficult it's been to get people in and out of schools, it's maybe lost a bit of its impact, but let's hope that we can get more visitors in again, because I think it really helps young people understand it's all very well having opinions and making quickfire opinions based on social media sort of updates, but when you actually talk to a politician, you can hear them building a kind of a background, if you like, a backdrop to why decisions are made. It helps people rationalise those, and actually that helps their critical thinking, and it helps the way they see the society they live in. And I think that's the biggest impact. It's not just that young people are being heard, it's that young people are hearing how decisions are made.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've been to a couple of the sittings there, and they're really, really interesting, and they're so thought provoking. And I mean, the turnout as well from especially when they had the when it was the build up to the Isle of Man general election, there was really a great deal amount of students there, probably 30-ish, I want to say. So have you noticed in the sixth form a lot more engagement from students in politics, whether they have been previously interested or not, since sort of the COVID pandemic? Do you think that's sort of changed things? And would you say there's been an uplift in students' interest?
I definitely think students now on the Isle of Man are more aware of Manx issues. I'm not necessarily sure I'd say politics. I'm not sure if they know the ins and the outs of what happens inside Tynwald or the role of the MLC or anything like that. But they definitely are more up to date about issues, and they have quite strong opinions, the vast majority of them, on the horse trams or on the landing station in Liverpool or on any particular local issue. Even today, you know, there were conversations in school about the inquiry and the results of the inquiry, and I heard students talking about it. I just don't think that would have been the case 20 years ago when I was at school. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because if the students are interested in that, then the education system should be responding to that and therefore saying, right, well, there's a captive audience here, because they do want to talk about issues that relate to them. And at the moment, because of the way our system is set up, which is a little bit the same as it was 30, 40 years ago, maybe the students aren't getting the opportunities to have those debates that you're talking about. And that is for us to look at, but it's not an easy solution, because you would have to change curriculum.
I mean, would you say that has come with a difference in perhaps political orientation? Would you say that that's perhaps kind of a factor in this, or would you say it's more so because it's become more of a socially acceptable thing for social media to be projecting all of these issues? Or would you say that that's come with the kind of, I think the general consensus of in the world right now is that the youth, specifically the Western youth, tend to lean just centre-left. The average kind of person our age, probably centre-left, maybe some obviously far left, far right, some definitely different. But would you say that is a factor in the way kind of students are becoming more engaged, is that they are beginning to form their own political orientation? I know social media is definitely a factor, but do you think that that's because they now have a position on things, or do you think it's just purely because the information is much more easily accessible nowadays?
I think it's both. If you look at the generation from maybe 5-10 years before I came along as a student, up to pretty much the COVID pandemic, it was a generation of status quo. There was world peace. There was no concept that we would ever be going towards a major war. There was a lot of prosperity, particularly on the Isle of Man. In huge pockets of Manx culture, in Manx society, there was a lot of money being spent, a lot of disposable income for quite a few people. And therefore, people tend, when you're in a period of status quo, people tend not to want to rock the boat, or not to even think about how one should rock the boat. Whereas when COVID came in, it asked us quite a lot of interesting questions about society and how society should be involved in our lives. That kind of concept about big government or not big government, because we had people whose jobs were taken away from them almost overnight. They were having to stay in their houses, and the government were having to jump in and finance that. And we had lots of people getting an incredible amount of free medical care. And free testing and free kits being sent to houses in ways that we just have never seen before. So it led young people to think, well, hold on, should this be the norm? Should society jump in this way normally? Should we be investing in the community at this kind of rate on a regular basis, even outside of a COVID situation? So from one point of view, any form of instability in society will always push people into asking new questions, and that definitely has led the younger element of society to say, okay, that was different, and I now need to say, was that something I liked or was that something I didn't like? And I need to reflect that in my opinions. The second thing is completely and utterly what Mika said. Young people have so much more access to different opinions than we had when I was younger. I mean, there was 5 channels when I was younger, and it was BBC or ITV, and that was your political difference, essentially. Did you watch the BBC News or did you watch the ITV News? We didn't even have Rupert Murdoch's Sky corporation coming along then, so it was very much limited to what we were hearing on television. Whereas now, you get a much more polarised form of politics, and that's good and bad, because it can mean that young people jump to knee-jerk reactions about things without looking into the whole case, but at the same time it gives them scope to have different opinions and to challenge opinions. So young people are definitely more politically aware than they used to be. I think Mika's right. I think that they are definitely of the left of centre, but I think there's also quite a large question as to how much further left a lot of young people want to go because of the injection of government help they saw in society during the COVID, and now obviously with the increase in gas bills, with the increase in fuel prices, electricity prices, then they're going to be saying, well, we want government back in. We want government helped us during COVID. Why won't government help us now? And you can hear that on Manx Radio. You can hear that on Energy FM. You can hear it anywhere. They're talking about it, and that's a conversation that I don't think would have been happening 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I feel like for young people, especially, the media really love to hear from them, and especially, young people getting involved in politics. The media will grab that like there's no tomorrow, because they want the youth to speak out in the difference of opinion. Mika, I'm sure you've got plenty more questions that you want to ask. Is there anything else further that you've that got pressing on your mind?
I think it's a good time to move on to the next question of how that kind of, if you're saying we've established that young people are much more politically aware these days for kind of for a plethora of factors, but would you say that in schools is there much kind of censorship of views, both from a teacher's perspective and from a student's perspective? Would you kind of, or not, maybe not you personally, but would schools in general discourage potentially that political expression, or would it be encouraged?
So is the question that would I encourage a student to express themselves, or would I encourage a teacher to express themselves?
I think is the question, you can take it either way. Is there much censorship of views, or is it encouraged in schools? Okay,
a really interesting question, because there's a lot of ambiguity in the sense. I've never been told that I can't say what I would want to say about politics. However, under the guidelines of what I perceive to be a professional and somebody who's not manipulating the minds of young people, then I wouldn't want to tell young people how they should think politically. So when I talk about politics, or when I teach politics, and I do teach politics at French A level, significantly teach politics. I teach about communism, I teach about Gaullism, I teach about the politics surrounding World War One and World War Two and how we came out of that, and we go on to talk about the Marshall Plan and the influence, obviously, at that point of the capitalist West trying to reduce the powers of the communist East. So I do teach it, but I teach it factually, because I don't think at any point that any student needs to know my opinion. I do think there's a fine line for a teacher between teaching facts and manipulating young people with their own opinions. And I just don't think that's something that where a teacher should be going, really. I think it's all got to be done very neutrally. I also think maybe that a student would lose a little bit of respect for a teacher if they started to use the forum for that particular reason, especially at A level, where students are so astute and so switched on that they wouldn't think that was a useful thing for them. Just from a completely ruthless point of view, what I think about politics isn't going to particularly help their A levels. If you just look at it from a core ruthless point like that. But yeah, no, I think that teachers need to keep very, very, very quiet about their particular leanings, and I think they need to engage youth with open debate, chairing open debate, keeping neutral, making sure that young people listen to each other. That's really important, and that making sure that if they disagree with another person, that they do so in a really polite way. Because actually, one thing I say to young people, without telling them my political leaning, is to say to them, you might change. You might change as you get older. I changed as I got older. And that was by meeting people at university, by debating with people at university, by going into employment, various different things that happened. It changed the way I think about things. So young people have to be careful, I think, at shouting each other down, and they have to make sure they listen to each other.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think another thing is that people can change over time. Especially, I think over the past couple of years, my views have slightly changed. They've not changed a huge amount. But I think for a lot of young people, and especially Archie, I imagine if he was here today, he'd go, well, just you wait. You'll be a completely different side of the political spectrum before you know it. I'm sure that's what he says to many of his peers. But yes, touching on the point of actually, expressing a view, an FOI request was actually submitted, I think, about this time last year, in regards to whether the department actually has any policy on political partisanship within school, i.e. Endorsement of a political figure or indeed any ideologies. And the department simply came back with, no, we do not have a policy for that, which is quite interesting in a sense, because you'd think that they possibly would. But I suppose when I have spoken to the department before, in terms of politics, they like to sort of leave it to the schools in a sense, especially in terms of when I've spoken to them about Manx politics. They say it's up to the schools to decide with the curriculum. But I do think it's whether they should have a policy or not. I mean, do you have any view on that, Mika, whether they should have a policy?
I do think it's quite astounding that there isn't an existing policy on this thing, because I think it could be so very easily kind of abused, that I think it is quite extraordinary that there is no existing policy on kind of endorsing political figures. In terms of Manx politics, I also am, again, with all kind of the government initiatives to bring the youth back to the Isle of Man and to showcase the kind of the good things about the island, I am again quite astounded that there is nothing perhaps mandating some form of Manx political education within schools. I think that we personally have two really great politics teachers, not sure they'd want to be named, but who really do kind of enrich us with that Manx culture, especially around the election time. We've learned quite a lot about how the Manx political system works, and I think through kind of Junior Tynwald and Model UN and things like that, we have been exposed quite a lot to Manx politics, but I also think that is down to good teachers. So had we not had these two really kind of great teachers who managed to factor it in for us, I'm not sure we would really be that informed about it. So it does seem kind of oxymoronic that the government are quite vocal about the benefits of the Isle of Man and how kind of good our political system is, but their kind of primary target market, which is the young people to come back to the island, obviously the age gap that we're missing in the labour market is slightly confusing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the opportunities for a young person here to get involved in Manx politics at times. I mean, Junior Tynwald is fantastic, and I wish it was monthly thing, but that's just one of those things. It's how it's always operating. It's it's great that it's always been there, but when we talk about schools and getting MHKs in, I know Ballacameen, especially with obviously the Voltaire Society, a lot of MHKs have been in, and that's a great thing. But a lot of schools, especially when I was at my previous school, there's a bit of a sometimes difficulty whether MHKs want to come in or are allowed to come in, and it comes down to the discretion of the head teacher to whether it's allowed.
Yeah, that's true. I would like to say one thing. Every time a politician that I'm aware of has been asked, they've come.
Mm-hmm.
Schools are difficult places to just walk into. I mean, because theoretically nobody should just walk into a school. There's got to be a tight safeguarding policy around that. But it does seem that when they are asked, they will come in. And I agree with you. I think when you're saying you think Junior Timmel should be monthly, okay, that's maybe going to be logistically quite difficult.
Yeah.
But maybe 6 monthly, and in the same way, we've got a certain amount of MHKs who are attached to our school because they our school sits in two different constituencies. So it would be great to invite them in on a more regular basis because they do always come in when invited, and after all, there are so many voters in our school.
Yeah.
It's a huge amount of people who are able to vote within our school population. So it would be good to have them in, but I do think it's a bit harsh to, not that you're doing it, but I know some people do it, to say that the politicians aren't trying to involve themselves with the youth, because they do. They come every time we ask. It's just getting that to be a more regular situation.
Yeah.
is the challenge.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there are a lot of MHKs that do want to certainly interact with young people, which is a great thing. Is there anything further that you want to touch on, Mika?
I mean, I think that as well, it is a potentially difficult thing for politicians to be kind of within that school environment, to get involved with young people, purely from this perspective of us not manipulating or not influencing children's political views. And for an MHK to come in, especially around election times, and kind of tell us what they stand for. I know with Manx politics, you don't typically get very many kind of extreme policies, but if, for example, a parent were to disagree with something that one of the MHKs was saying, it could be perceived as pushing it onto their children, which could lead to quite a bit of bother for the school, for the MHK, for the Department of Education. It could lead to a little bit of animosity, you could say, between kind of how politics is handled again. And I just think that coming off of your kind of teachers have to be extremely careful with how they express their views, that surely carries through to people who teachers bring in, or people who the head teacher brings in to schools. So again, that also could be a bit of a reservation. And
that has been something that we have, not with MHKs, but with other visitors, we have experienced difficulties when they have expressed opinions. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to name any particular visitors, I think that would be unprofessional, but sometimes parents have got in touch and said, we're not happy that they said that, and we don't feel that in the modern day those sort of views should be expressed in a school by a visiting speaker. And so we do have to be careful in that respect, and also we have to understand that being an MHK is the life of these people. This is their livelihood, this is their career, so we do want to make sure that they're not put at any risk by coming in and as Mika says, being accused of manipulating people by what they say in an assembly is their political ideology. But what would be good, and how to use them in a really, not that I'm going on radio and saying we should use MHKs, but how we could use MHKs in a really, really effective manner is to get them in and explain the process of what it is to be an MHK, or what is the role of Tynwald, what is the difference between an MHK and an MLC. What is an Attorney General? Mm-hmm. What is the role of the Attorney General on the MLC? All of those kind of questions. Why is there a religious representation on the MLC? All of these sort of questions that young people will want to know as they get older. It would really help their understanding of politics if we could go through the workings of, and we've got MHKs on our doorstep to come in and help us work through that. And then you could sort of say, right, well, let's take a modern day issue. Let's take the horse trams, right? You got Tim Krukle at the moment, every day seeing sort of coming out and having to justify this thing or that thing. It would be much easier for young people to be able to get their heads around a complex issue such as the horse trams if they knew how Manx politics worked. Tim Krukle can't just write a cheque for 9 million and say, let's sort the horse trams. There are so many different things that he has to go through and that he has to negotiate just to get one part of that project going again. So I think if young people understood that, they would be much less critical and much more understanding of the process. And that would, for me, would make a stronger government in 20 years' time. Because people who understood and were educated would then grow up and think, right, if this is how it works, then I either want to go into it and change it or want to go into it the way it is. And that would create a very healthy future for politics on the Isle of Man. But at the moment, what happens is, because we don't do so much Manx politics on the Isle, in schools, kids grow up with social media opinions, which are generally quite negative, as I said, quite polarised. And they then just get on the bandwagon. And, you'll hear year nines walking around the corridors slagging off the horse trams. And you think, I'm not sure if you know the complexities of that issue. And if you did, and if we could teach you them, then maybe you'd have a bit more sympathy for how that situation has developed. Who knows? It's an idea worth looking at. The one thing we also haven't talked about is the other side of politics. We're kind of talking about the people.
Yes.
We're talking about the MHKs. The sort of social... the social issues about politics, the pressure groups, how pressure groups work, how demonstrations work, the freedom of speech, all that kind of thing. We can definitely do more about that in school.
I think that I was going to say something actually about that while you were speaking. It just that politics has very many layers to it. It's not purely just about perspectives and political orientation. There are so many ways to teach politics in a neutral fashion, just purely teaching the theory. I know for our A level we learn a lot about kind of institutions and the inner workings. We learn about
how
the
things
Constitution, how things are influenced, and I think it is so very easy to teach politics. I mean, probably not easy is not the correct word here, but I think there is so many different ways in which you can teach politics without having to even touch upon the side of kind of social issues and the Second Amendment and Roe versus Wade and all these kind of social issues that potentially could be maybe not as easy to teach to younger years, at least, although they are difficult issues and should be addressed. There are so many different ways we can integrate politics. And that does kind of lead on to the next question, unless you've got anything else on this.
I just wanted to add something quickly. For a lot of people, they see it as Conservative versus Labour. That is what politics is. Yeah. And it annoys me a little bit. Politics is everything. It's how we are governed. It's what people believe in. It's so much. It's such a broad area. But for a lot of people, it's very confined, and it's, it's seen as, it's for older people. It's for, people that just get annoyed about things. And, for some people it is. But it's a lot more than that. And I definitely say that, politics is a fantastic thing to get involved with.
It's a game, it's a jigsaw. And that's the one thing that I think I've understood as I've got older. Like you're saying, it's not necessarily about whether you're right wing or left wing. Understanding politics, particularly in the Isle of Man, is understanding the pressures that the politicians have in fitting the jigsaw pieces together, both economically, both within the constituencies that you have on the Isle of Man, trying to keep everyone happy, the idea of not in my backyard. You've got so many things to balance, and that is maybe something we don't think about. We're so quick to say, why haven't they sorted that road out? Why haven't they done that? And yet we don't think, but just 2 miles away, there's something really good that's just happened. And maybe that came as a priority because economically they couldn't do both in the same year. We just haven't quite thought. I don't think we have a long-termism when we talk about politics on the Isle of Man. I think we're always quick on the short term. And that's one thing I would definitely want to talk about in terms of education with young people, how to see the big picture of politics.
Yeah, which is completely what I believe turns a lot of young people off about it. They just see it as, very, very complicated, and this is really what PolitiBabble has been about. When me and Archie, when Archie set it up, it was about with Sam and Brescia and Ewan, was about breaking things down and making it relevant to young people, which is what needs to be technically done from the very top. Government is seen as Archie always says, if a young person sees a government logo, they'll just scroll away, or they won't even look at it. But I think that politics should be made accessible for everyone. But back to you, Mika, on your point that you're going to talk about.
That's a very, very good introduction into this next question is of should politics be a core subject? And I know there's a few different kind of ways you could approach this question. One obviously being the benefit for students, but another kind of being perhaps the reservations of teachers about it being core subject. I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and one thing that was brought up was teachers, when they teach politics, may be potentially difficult for them to keep neutral, because obviously it is a very politically inducing kind of topic, politics. But I think one point that was brought up was in terms of teaching might have the syllabuses and the curriculums might have implications of kind of views, which is obvious as they were set up by our government. They're obviously going to not look too harshly upon our governmental system. But I think one point raised was that teachers may find it easy to teach something that they agree with. So, for example, we're living in a liberal democracy right now. If teachers think that is a good system to live by, then they will be teaching the curriculum of said democracy. However, if we were living under totalitarian reign, teachers may find it more difficult to deliver the materials given to them by that government. So what are your thoughts on whether politics should be a core subject from both the students and the teachers' perspective?
Yeah, my mum went to school in the 1960s. She's a baby boomer, and she once said to me that Latin and the study of Latin was fundamental to her, because it completely and utterly came up in everything that she studied from that point on. It seemed to just constantly keep appearing, whether it was prefixes or suffixes of words and stuff like that. And I feel exactly the same about politics. I feel that when I first studied politics at the age of 17, if I hadn't studied politics and if I hadn't gone through that course at A-level, I think my life would have been significantly emptier without it going forward, because it seems to have crept up in almost everything and in so many conversations, social conversations when I was travelling, conversations when I've been to different countries, different continents. A lot of it comes back to politics, and a lot of my reasoning, a lot of my rational thinking comes back to politics. A lot of my critical thinking comes back to politics. And so with that viewpoint, it worries me that we have students leaving school who have not gone through that form of education, because whatever happens to them, whatever they become, whatever job they do, they will have to confront politics, because they will have to understand what is happening in their society, why it is happening, and try to rationalise that for themselves. And we've seen that in the last 2 years with the explosion of political opinion on social media. Sometimes some of the things you read, you think to yourself, I'm not sure that person would have had that opinion if they'd been educated through the system that I've been educated, just in terms of rationalising and not being so critical, not necessarily in terms of ideology. And therefore, the answer, I suppose rather long-windedly, is yes, I believe it should be core. I'm a bit uncomfortable with core as a concept, actually, to be honest. I don't like the idea of 3 core subjects. I think what it's led to is an over-investigation on 2 subjects in particular. I don't know if you can ever be over-taught English, because it's our language, and it's an incredibly important skill to have, to be able to develop and use your language, both in a written and oral form. But I do think that we turn kids off maths and science by over-teaching in terms of modules. We tend to forget that they don't actually need all of the stuff that we're teaching them. They need a certain amount of it. Yeah. And of course they do, and that's why they're core, because they do crop up in everyday life. But I'm not sure if some of the things that I learned in maths have ever been useful since the day I closed my GCSE maths paper. And I think you could probably fill some of that time with maybe some philosophy thought, some political thought, so that we can start educating future generations, exactly as I said before, in areas of life that will affect them when they get older, as opposed to necessarily knowing what X and Y are on a graph. That's quite a controversial thing that I've just said, and I don't know how the maths department are going to feel about me tomorrow when I see them. Going on to Mika's point, I definitely wouldn't allow it to be taught by non-subject specialists, though, because I think that's where you would end up with politics becoming a controversial subject in school. It has to be taught, as you said, by people like the two people who are teaching you, who are incredibly neutral, and they open debates up beautifully, and they open up debates about society and current issues very beautifully. That's how politics should be taught, really. I think if you just did it as part of a PSHE program and every tutor taught it, it would be putting certain tutors in a very difficult position, because they don't have that extensive background in the area.
Yeah.
Whereas if it was core anyway, I'd expect that there would be specialist teachers to teach it. That's a really exciting idea, by the way. We're putting something pretty big out there.
Yeah,
I think,
definitely.
Yeah, I think in terms of going back to your thing about core subjects, I think we've already had this conversation as part of a group discussion at school, but core subjects don't always necessarily, it's not always necessarily about the content that sets you up for life. I think that maths brings logical skills, brings problem solving that you wouldn't be able to get from anything else. So albeit potentially the content itself might not be as important, the skills that you gain from learning that content and persevering at it are, I think, extortionate. And same applies for politics, although some people may say, oh, why do we need to know kind of the workings of the chambers, and why do we need to know about the Legislative Council? But I think it's more so about having the awareness that information does exist, if that makes sense. I think so many people before kind of taking our politics course, probably you excluded because you're very knowledgeable from the get-go, but so many people just did not know the extent of what was out there. And I think that our two teachers honestly really should be used as a blueprint, because I don't think I've ever seen, not that I've seen much politics be taught, but I don't think I've ever seen such an intricate kind of teaching style that somehow still remains neutral while exposing us to such a broad kind of spectrum of views. So I think, unless you've got anything else.
I just want to jump in on that, because I agree with Mika that there are hugely transferable skills, very much like learning a language, which is not necessarily always about learning the language. It's about learning the analytical skills, the confidence in speaking, the incredibly difficult skill of listening. And that is where languages are so important in schools. Not necessarily when people say to me, "What's the point in learning Germany? I'm never going to go to German. I'm never going to go to Germany." I would say, well, hold on a minute. It's not just about learning the language. And I agree with you about maths. I just sometimes feel that we just turn certain students off by overdoing certain core subjects. And maybe there's a place for a bit of change in that area.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reason why we've touched so much on Manx politics back and forth, as well as talking about sort of the curriculum of politics, is that, you know, we are governed by 24 MHKs, and then I think it's 11 people in the Legislative Council. It's an awful lot of politicians for a small area. I'm not going to go into whether that's the right amount or not, because that's a long conversation.
Next episode of PolitiBabble.
But it's so important, our system over here, you know, as being the longest continuous democracy in the world, and that we are not heavily teaching politics, especially at the lower end of the scale. I think that's a huge problem, and I think that's something that really the Department of Education really needs to look at and assess, really, because, you know, when it came to the election, and me and Archie ran a campaign for to entice really young people and make them aware that, you know, they are able to vote. We had several MHKs, and I'm not going to say any names or anything, but that came to us and said, you know, how, with only a matter of days before the election, how can I appeal to young people, you know, kind of speak to you and all this kind of thing. And you know, I really do think that we need to see some change on that note. But before we wrap up and go on to current affairs, do you have any more questions, Mika? And is there anything that you want to add on anything that we've discussed or we've not mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, just listening to you then, I think if we did bring it into schools, we'd have to bring it in by teaching the issues as opposed to teaching about the people.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you start teaching... Sorry, frog in the throat. I think if you start teaching about the people, then that's where it becomes a bit polarised. And I'm not sure if it's actually a very progressive thing to do, because those people will change.
Yeah.
But the issues,
mm-hmm.
they'll stay
and
the
the
same.
system that we operate under.
I think just a last thing, for it to be kind of a core subject, from what age should it be implemented into the specifications? I think, do you have any views on perhaps? I know that, again, we do have to remember that politics is a very intricate matter to cover, and to kind of expose very young children to kind of the inner workings of perhaps our systems could, like you said, put them off. But from what age do you think it would be good if it were to be a core subject, if it were to be implemented into the school system on a permanent basis? From what age would you say that was?
Well, I'm not going to give it a fixed area, because I don't really know what would be an appropriate age, because I'm not don't really know that kind of thing, as not being an educational specialist. But what I can say is an MLC, Kerry Sharp, said a couple of years ago on a debate show with Paul Moulton, when she talked about Manx politics and how it's taught in school, she said that perhaps when we look at younger, we should be just implementing the very basics of things, and then really ramping it up. But if I was going to give a view, I'd probably say the end of primary school, and most MHKs tend to give children at the very end of primary school a tour round the legislative buildings. But I do think it's important that we incorporate global politics as well, which is another thing that's, I know I'm going back off topic, but global perspectives. I only heard of that when I joined Ballycameen, and that sort of delves into a slight bit of politics as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a humanity. It's a new GCSE in the sense that it's going to be examined for the first time this year, and it's run at this point only in Key Stage 4, so only for the GCSE year groups. But there is talk at some point of developing it down the A-level route. We've just got to get the exam board right and make clever decisions in that respect. So I wouldn't want to knee-jerk into it straight away. I'd also think with any new subject you need to see the results at GCSE before you bring it in. But yeah, that is very interesting in terms of developing the way students think about the rest of the world and the issues that the rest of the world face. It's in a way it's quite similar to human geography, but as a kind of separate standalone subject. I just thinking about what you were saying about the perfect age, and like I said before, right at the start of the programme, I lived in France, and the French education system, there is a philosophy lesson per week from the age of 11. And what's interesting in that is they don't really divorce philosophy and politics in France. Your philosophy builds your politics.
Yeah.
So what they do in philosophy, I mean, they don't sit there and read Jean-Jacques Rousseau all week. They will discuss various different issues to do with France, or how they feel about the motto of France, or how they feel about being a French citizen and what that means to them. And then from that, over a period of time, they will develop their political opinions. And so I remember going to university in France at the age of 21 and just feeling really ignorant, because although I'd done a politics A-level at Ballycameen, these guys were just so switched on politically. And I remember, because I was going in just after the 2002 general election, which was a huge general election for France, because Jacques Chirac just beat Jean-Marie Le Pen, and the whole country was talking about it. And I just thought, wow, I don't think I'd walk into a student union at York University, where I was, and have the whole bar talking about an election. I just don't think that would be the case. So, and I said to someone, how come you're so switched on about this? They said, well, we've been doing it since we were 11. And I thought, there you go. That's how you build a strong political and philosophical generation.
Excellent. Well, if we have any further points to add, then we'll move on to our current affairs. Well, firstly, we will look at the Isle of Man, and in the past week, we had a video released by an Isle of Man historian, Charles Gard, which looked into the sort of damaging effects that lack of upkeep on Isle of Man tourism. Secondly to that, we had the release of the report into the Dr. Rosalind Ranson case against the Department of Health and Social Care, and that tribunal ruled that Dr. Rosalind Ranson was unfairly treated. And backing that up, David Ashford has recently just said that he is not considering his position following this decision. So there are just a couple of things that have cropped up this week. The Charles Gard video was very interesting, and it really made you. They were minor details, but they do have a huge impact, and it especially focuses on the area that we are right now, Douglas Head. Is there any thoughts from yourselves on the video?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking before about making sure that we had patience with politics and politicians when we're talking about major strategic decisions where they're having to balance things and put jigsaw pieces in the right jigsaw holes. However, when it comes to aesthetics and just pretty simple aesthetics, I think that's why that video got so many views. I mean, I don't know if Charles Gard would be actually over the moon that when you type the Isle of Man, it now comes up with that video of his very first hit on Google on YouTube, because Charles Gard's done so much amazing work in promoting the Isle of Man, and all of those incredible videos he makes about the Isle of Man just look so gorgeous. And I used to live in England, watch those videos, and think I've got to get home. But that's probably why this video has been so well received by the public, because they know that this is a person who loves the Isle of Man. His heart is very much in his soul. He bleeds man. That's what he is. And so for him to put that out there was a very, very brave move, and I think respected. I actually think it's been very well respected and received by the politicians as well. I have to say I've been very impressed by the openness and the honesty that they've shown in how they've come forward about it and said, I think it's great in life where people put their hand up and say, do you know what, that video does expose some things that we need to sort out. So hopefully a positive for the island in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. Mika, is there anything else that you wanted to add? Did you watch? Did you see the video?
Yes. Yeah. I think that Sir's pretty much covered it, but I do think that the Isle of Man has this reputation, whether it's just or unjust, does have this reputation for falling on the small details, on the minor things that could be done without such bureaucracy, but somehow always manage to end up in administrative and logistical kind of complexities and complications and delays. And I think that some of these, especially with the TT coming up now for the first time in a long time, as it feels like anyway, I think it is quite important for us to really take that on board. And like you say, I think it was a brave move from someone who has shown quite a lot of support for the Isle of Man in the past. I
think it's a bit of a... We're all very proud to live on the Isle of Man. Well, I certainly am. And I think the vast majority of people I know are proud to live on the Isle of Man. And I do sometimes think that we're so protective of it and we're so proud of it that we do get ourselves down about things that maybe other people who are coming over wouldn't see.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with what people are saying, that there are definitely some small aesthetic things that need to be sorted out. But the island is actually in a really good shape. I know that because I came over from England, and I was just blown away by how good it looked. Because, for example, so much less graffiti than where I was in England, so much more litter than where I was in England, so much less antisocial behaviour than where I was in England. And therefore, I'm still in that kind of bubble where I walk around thinking the island's just still a great place. Like, let's not get too down about it. Maybe it's good that we're such perfectionists, but at the same time, we've also got to see the big picture is that we're in a pretty good place. We're okay. And I love the fact that we are now going to change. We're going to hopefully sort all those things out in that video. But I do think that we have to be realistic and say we're okay.
Yeah, I definitely agree that we are not in a bad place. So to finally just round up Isle of Man current affairs. For those of you who don't know, in the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lady who was leading the Isle of Man's sort of response to COVID-19 is the medical director, Dr. Rosalind Ranson, because actually the public health directorate, Dr. Henrietta Hewitt, was actually away, which is another quite startling thing when there was a world pandemic underway, and it was by February time it was clearly spreading. But over the past week there was a tribunal, and this was really to do with how Dr. Rosalind Ranson was treated, and she was actually it was confirmed by Manx media over last summer that she was allegedly dismissed, and now it's been confirmed that through the tribunal, and I think it made some quite startling sort of realizations of how DHSC were treating her, and especially the higher management, and as well things were being passed on, and the communication by the people at the very top there. And we had a statement come out yesterday from Alfred Cannon, the Chief Minister, to say that he will be making a statement, not on the on the issue, but about sort of the culture, as he can't go into it in too much detail at the moment because it's at the sub-judiciary phase. But the report, 200 pages long, very interesting. I scanned through, and some of the things that were said were really quite concerning. Is there any sort of bits that you want to pick up on that?
I mean,
on that issue?
There was another thing as well within the kind of off the back of not off the back, in the midst of the pandemic, with Dr. Rachel Glover.
Yeah.
Again, another DHSC thing where there was kind of a bit of, I mean, one could say animosity, but it was a little bit more like conflict with kind of a Twitter coming in and Ashford saying that that she wasn't employed by or something along the lines of that, and it was all again another big controversy. So for this to happen again, it kind of seems a bit like deja vu.
Yeah, and it clearly shows that within DHSC, especially at the very top, there is some serious problems, and either they things have changed or they are fixed. But I mean, Alfred Cannon's going to give a statement on things in the coming days, but it certainly is very, very questionable. And I mean, some of the statements that were made. But Dr. Rachel Glover was involved in the tribunal. She was giving evidence in support, and her experiences as well with Dr. Ranson. But I think we'll wrap up.
Could I just say on that if I was, for example, taking this as a politics lesson in a school, and this is where politics is important, the ins and the outs of the case are not necessarily for me to comment on, but the idea that we live in a society where the rule of law is so important, and where we have a judiciary that upholds accountability, that's something that's really important. And from that case, you could teach somebody in school how important the checks and balances system in our society is, and that's where politics is so crucial that we get more politics into school, because otherwise people will just see that as a conversation where somebody else can go off and slag the government off. But actually, that's not what the core issue is there. The core issue is that our government allow a checks and balances system, and that we have the rule of law, and those kind of things, as a Manx citizen, they should be celebrated, and that is the message that I get from that case.
Well, just to look on the UK side of things, it's been reported by the BBC News that the police issue 50 more fines to Downing Street in regards to the COVID fines, and with the battle between Sir Keir and Boris at the moment on their COVID experiences, which have been very interesting. It is quite shocking what's going on there, and 100 fines for one building, and the person responsible is still in power. It's shocking.
I mean, I
really.
watched Sir Keir's live statement the other day regarding, for those of you who don't know, Keir Starmer has now also been accused of misconduct during the kind of going against the the guidelines. He was having a beer, which
Yeah,
was
allegedly at the
during,
moment, supposedly, yeah.
supposedly during a work day, and it's a very back and forth thing. And he came out and he made a statement. Can't remember what day it was, but I watched
Monday,
it live.
I think.
It might have
Yeah,
been
yeah.
Monday. And he said that if he was to be fined, he would resign. And I think that a lot of people are very kind of surprised by that, because he's taking a gamble, really, there. He's leaving his fate down to the Durham police.
Really is, yeah.
And a lot of people are confused. I think a lot of people kind of think that if he thinks that it's unjustified for him to get fined, if he's that confident in himself, then good for him. But I also really do think that it's quite a tactical move by Labour there. It's a show of kind of solidarity. And it enables them, even if he is to be fined, it enables them to carry on without that kind of shadow of misconduct. But it also, if he comes out on top, he then looks like a much bigger winner, and he's kind of putting Boris's prospect